Okay, so this is a nice way to segue now into the attachment relationship. I just would like to say, I just finished that last slide and said that you usually see them starting to develop emotional regulation at 6 to 7 months. Really, that's when you can actively see it. Really, they've started it all the way from birth, but what I just meant by that is where you can really see the active signs and active strategies, and they start becoming a bit better at it. And that has a lot to do with their cognitive development as well as their social development. Okay, so just before I talk about attachment, I want to bring in Erikson here. Erikson, if you recall, he had the theories or the stages of psychosocial development, and there were 8 of them, and each one has a crisis that the person has to overcome. And there are 2 that are relevant here for the purposes of what we're talking about. And they are both mentioned in your book, and so hopefully you've picked up on that. The one was basic trust versus mistrust. So this is very critical in terms of development because babies are born without any ability to fend for themselves, and so they need other people for food, protection, and they really can't survive without them. And so Erikson talked about how the first stage of psychosocial development, that this lasted from infancy to about 18 months, was all about the baby learning to trust their caregivers. And some of the critical elements in developing this trust are things like sensitivity, responsiveness, consistent caregiving. They need to know that they can develop, that they know that they have a caregiver that's going to provide reliably good care and affection and be sympathetic and loving. And they really want to come to recognize the world as a good and gratifying place. Children who lack this trust, it leads to mistrust, is what Erikson talked about, and they view the world much more as inconsistent and unpredictable, and it can be highly stressful for children. The other stage that's relevant here is autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is that toddler period of time when children, if you recall, by 18 months now, they're those little scientists that we talked about with Piaget. And so they are beginning to explore their surroundings, particularly if they have developed this trusting relationship. And they want to try to do things on their own. Feeding, dressing, going to the bathroom. They're developing this sense of self-sufficiency. If they don't develop it, if they learn that they can't do these things, then it usually leads to a sense of shame about their own abilities. So again, what Erikson just talked about is that children in this phase, they need to develop a sense of personal control over their physical skills and a sense of independence. And success then leads to feelings of autonomy, failure results in feelings of shame and doubt. Okay, so what is attachment? Well, here's my definition. It's this enduring emotional connection. So it's not just hugging. Okay, there's an actual emotional bond or relationship between the caregiver and a child. And you'll see that I have a male in this picture. That's not by accident because it doesn't have to be mom. It's anybody who's the primary caregiver to that young little one there. And you'll notice I used the word bidirectional. And what that just means, it's an affectionate relationship that an infant or a child later on has with a very specific person that's called the primary attachment figure. And it's this emotional connection that the infant has or the child has to the caregiver. It's also reciprocated by the caregiver. So that's what they mean by bidirectional or reciprocal. And I would just like to say it's not the same as bonding, because bonding is really, when we talk about bonding, we talk about it more as being unidirectional. The mother bonding with the child, the father bonding with the child. In this case, the key part is this reciprocity in this affectional relationship between the two. Okay, attachment theory was developed by a guy named John Bowlby, and he emphasized the crucial role that attachment plays in development, both early on and later on in life. And he discussed how there were these 4 characteristics or distinguishing things that defined attachment. And the one was safe haven. So the idea here is that the child can always return to the attachment figure for comfort and safety in the face of fear or threat. So say a child feels threatened or frightened because, say, they found this toy in a toy box, and they take a look at this toy and it scares them. And so what they do is they start crying, and then the caregiver comes over, removes the toy, and hugs them. So that would be an example of a safe haven. The other one that as another characteristic is secure base. So the idea here is that the child has the security of at least one trusting relationship that they can always return to, and that gives them then the courage to be able to explore the surrounding environment, because they know that they always have this one solid foundation of a person that can always bring them a sense of safety and security. The next one is proximity maintenance. So proximity maintenance is the idea that in this case they have a desire to be near the people who they're attached to. So the child will aim to explore the world but still tries to stay close to their caregiver. So you can see this where, say you see this maybe in some of the centers that you're at, the child will want to explore, but at the same time you might see them holding on to mom's pant leg or dad's pant leg for a bit anyway. And then the last one is separation distress. And what I'm going to say, this is what you would say happens, is separation anxiety. And this occurs when that attachment figure leaves and the child becomes unhappy and maybe even like quite sorrowful when they're separated. So they'll really cry loudly, you know, say when the parent or the primary caregiver leaves the center, say where you're working. I'm sure you see that one quite often. So Bowlby described attachment as following along these 4 phases of attachment or stages of attachment. And so the first one was called the pre-attachment phase. This is very reflex dominated, and it spans just the time when activities are focused around, you know, crying, rooting, grasping, and these behaviors will cause the caregiver to want to attach to babies. A key part here is around the 2 months. When by then the social smile is there, and that really evokes care and love in the child. So this at the beginning here is just about the caregiver feeling needed and wanting to meet the baby's needs. But really there's not much coming from the baby, right? Then the next one is called attachment in the making phase. And this one here spans about 6 weeks to about 6 to 8 months. It depends on the child. And this is when the baby begins to react differently and more quickly to the primary caregiver than to strangers. And they start building that trust with the caregiver that the caregiver is going to be able to fulfill their needs. So at this stage here, they are slowly starting to understand that their caregiver is the primary person that they can trust, but they have a slight preference for the caregiver. They'll still respond to everybody. This is that very social phase when they're like the life of the party, and so they'll pretty well interact with anybody. And then the next phase is the called clear-cut attachment, and this one here is, as the word implies, this is when the child starts to have a very clear understanding of who their primary caregivers are, and they are solidly attached to the caregiver. And so you'll start seeing things like separation anxiety starting to emerge at this point. So babies want to maintain contact with the main caregiver, and they'll express displeasure when the caregiver's not around. So a primary example here, right, is that just before this happened, when grandma came around to the door to visit, baby was really happy, and it didn't matter if mom left or not. But now what happens is that when grandma comes over, if mom leaves, there will be fussing and some distress. This is when you start seeing babies engage in simple social games like pat a cake. They'll start engaging in very social rituals like hello and goodbye. And they'll like be quite talkative, maybe even, or makes other sounds to show their emotional or physical reactions to different things. And this is also where you start seeing the child also engage in social referencing as well. And the last phase is called the reciprocal relationship phase, and this spans from about 18 to 24 months, but it really goes well beyond that. And this is where babies are taking an active role in that reciprocal idea of that reciprocal affectionate relationship that I said was central to attachment. And so they'll start negotiating with caregivers to meet their needs and to keep them feeling safe and attached. So they'll express their needs and their desires, even if they're counter to what the primary caregiver believes to be true. And so, when I say about negotiating, it would be like things like temper tantrums. But they start to understand things like what the word no means, and they understand that there's certain boundaries and certain things they can do and certain things they can't do. And they really start understanding how they fit into social relationships and how they have their own sense of identity. And so this is in part why we also start talking here about the self-concept like they have in that chapter. Just before I talk about factors impacting attachment, I just thought of another example of what I meant by that reciprocity of attachment. And it's one I imagine that you folks are quite knowledgeable about. And you can usually tell when it's at this phase because kids will start to have a very good understanding of the timetables of their parents. So they know at what time their parents are going to return home or perhaps return to the child care center. And they know that their parents work at certain times each day. And this really helps them helps the separation anxiety lessen, and it's a great part of that. But the reciprocity part that you see is that children may start doing things to gain extra time with the parents prior to departure or to keep the parents from leaving. And so these are all examples of where they're trying to negotiate with the parent and recognizing that they have a role to play. And parents can help a child by explaining to them why they're leaving, when they're going to be coming back, and to ensure that they're meeting their basic needs and also keeping their word. I just wanted to add that. Okay, in terms of factors that impact the attachment relationship, many of these also you've seen elsewhere. So you have, in terms of the child factors, you'll see I have things like temperament. If there's a presence of a medical conditions, that certainly will impact the attachment relationship, particularly if there's a lot of time spent in, say, hospitals and time away, or perhaps early on, if they're in, like, say, incubators and you don't get that skin-to-skin contact, even that beginning part of that bonding. And then there are also certain parent factors that also play a role. And you'll notice that I purposely and deliberately, again, made sure I have a male and a female here because gendered is not a factor that you have to consider. Usually the factors that you have to look at are things like the attachment relationship history of the parents, and that's discussed in your book, on your chapter as well, when they talked about how attachment and the transmission of attachment patterns in the AAI. The mental health of the parent matters because they can't necessarily be emotionally available to somebody else if they're having a hard time with their own emotional well-being or psychological well-being or spiritual well-being. Another key part here, and this is discussed in part in your book, in a minute I'll allude to that, but is the caregiver's behavior. And so usually when we look at that, we look at things like how sensitive are they. Another term we use is attunement, ATTUNEMENT. And that describes how parents and other caregivers react to an infant's signals. So well-attuned caregivers can detect what their babies are feeling and reflect those emotions back in their facial expressions, their voices, and other behaviors. And the thing is, they're ready, they can read a baby's signals and then respond to those signals. Okay, so that, again, that term is called attunement. Another part of this is acceptance. So versus the contrast to that would be rejection. So they're very positive, delighted. They make that child seem like the center of the universe. Accessibility refers to how attentive they are. So do they pay attention to the child, or do they ignore them? This one right here, where I see it a lot, is when you see parents interacting with, or supposed to be spending time with their children, and they're busy texting. It's one that drives me nuts because I always think about how important accessibility is to the attachment relationship. And then the last one refers to cooperative. Cooperative is a misleading word. I think the better word is respectful of a child's needs. And again, this can be both verbal or nonverbal, and really all of these things kind of tie in together. Your book talked about mutual regulation, and this all ties into that as well. The ability of both the infant and the caregiver to respond appropriately and sensitively to each other's mental and emotional states. That's what they referred to as mutual regulation. And they talked about the still phase paradigm and the importance of social referencing, so I'm going to leave that for you to look at. Something else that we can't forget about here, though, and that is the context that the child lives in. And so these would be things like the social support that a parent has, the finances, the neighborhood, the culture. I'm just drawing a blank. Bronfenbrenner. It's the whole idea where you guys looked at the mesosystems and the exosystems when you did your paper way back when. We can't deny the fact that the attachment relationship develops within the context. And so sometimes a parent and how they parent has nothing to do with their actual skill set. It could actually have to do with the context in which they're raising their child. So especially this is true in terms of the impact of context. If we look at stress, particularly toxic stress. So let's just say you have a parent who lacks social support, or is perhaps maybe lost their job, and so they're enduring a lot of financial hardship. Well, then what happens is that when the baby cries, that just leads to more anger, more stress for the parent, and then that leads to more crying, and then that leads to more stress. And what happens there is that often you'll see a breakdown in the parent and child relationship in terms of attachment, because even though the parent may be particularly skilled at things like attunement, the context in which they're raising the child is preventing them from being able to foster that kind of synchronous, mutually reciprocal relationship. So why am I talking about it? Because I think that Bowlby was right. I think that Bowlby was right that attachment is absolutely crucial for both emotional and social development. I would even say it was crucial for cognitive development. And certainly I have seen this when I look at children who demonstrate such resilience in the face of things like physical abuse, domestic violence. And it's amazing having a primary person that they have a good, secure relationship with, an attachment with, how it can buffer against things that really should be detrimental to that child's development. Similarly, I've also seen it where there are some primary caregivers who, for a variety of reasons, were not able to form a secure attachment with their children, and you do see it. You see it in terms of behavioral problems that they're exhibiting. Things like empathy and social skills are some of the prime examples. And I just have a quote here from Greg Moran. He's a guy at the University of Western Ontario, retired by now, I'm sure, since I studied under him. And here's just a quote. I think it's a nice summary of why attachment matters. I thought I would also just give you a picture so you can see how important the attachment is. So if we look here, what happens is if you have a child and they have a need, okay, and then it leads to arousal, That need is met and it relaxes. And this is the cycle that happens for the young infant, right? So they're hungry, they start to cry, the primary caregiver gives them food, they can relax. They have a diaper that's soiled, that makes them uncomfortable, they get their diaper changed, that helps them relax. Perhaps they're tired, the parent or their primary caregiver recognizes those signals, puts them to bed, maybe helps soothe them, and then they relax, and then they're great. Here's what happens though with some people is that cycle is broken. Instead, what you have is you have a need that leads to arousal, the need is unmet, and then that just leads to emotional distress. And it's this emotional distress that keeps happening again and again. It's chronic, and it leads to lack of a relaxation and just more difficulty in terms of both stress and anxiety, as well as difficulties in terms of emotional regulation. I'm not going to talk about the difference between secure, avoidant, and ambivalent and disorganized attachment because that's just mentioned in your book. Essentially, what the takeaway message I would want to give is that ideally you want the child to be securely attached, because a child with secure attachments is confident in the attachment figure's availability as a source of comfort and reassurance at a time of stress, and that's awesome. Whereas children with insecure or maybe even a disorganized attachment, they don't have that same consistent expectation that the attachment figure will be there to help them and to deal with the emotional distress. And then that can lead to other challenges. So I've just given you this picture, and I'm going to leave it to you to go and look at Ainsworth's study. I think also in your ebook they have some videos of the actual strange situation. It's actually quite interesting to look at. As somebody who's been the stranger in the strange situation, I can tell you it is a nice paradigm for getting a real sense of how a child trusts that relationship. When they talk about the importance of attachment, often what they'll talk about is something called internal working models. And this is kind of like a schema, if you think of it that way. So they've kind of taken the ideas of Piaget, that there's these foundations for understanding the world, and they say the same thing happens for our sense of self, and especially our sense of self in relationship. And so an internal working model is a set of expectations and beliefs about the self, others, and the relationship between that self and that other. And often what they'll do is that they'll talk about how this internal working model, the child has certain expectations and beliefs about things like their own behavior, other people's behavior. Key here is whether or not they're lovable and worthy of love. And the last one is going back again to the fundamentals that Erikson talked about, that part of this internal working model is they say, you know what, I know there are people there to help protect me, to support me, that are interested in me, that are available and want to connect with me. And all of these things basically go together. So I always like to look at internal working model as self within a relationship, and considering that there's also this other. So what are relationships? How do I fit into relationships? How do relationships work? Are there certain things you can predict from other people? Can I feel like do I feel like I'm worthy, that I have people around me that want to love me, that I'm lovable? And again, that you have this security and trust of knowing that there's always going to be somebody there for you. Another way of looking at the importance of the attachment is to consider the role that the attachment figure plays in meeting the child's needs that I talked about before when I talked about the attachment cycle. And I wish I had the source here. I know it was from some kind of adoption agency out of the UK where I found these needs walls. And I thought they really nicely showed the importance of the early attachment relationship for laying down the foundation for later development. So what they talked about first is that how your needs at the beginning are, they mainly just focus on things like security and even fundamental things like food, comfort, and like that these things come from things like stimulation, eye contact. You'll see the word attunements there. And then next layered on that is by the age of 2, now you see these other social relationships become important. So things like understanding that there's boundaries between people, and that there's also this, that you can look to peers and siblings and other family members for your sense of belonging. And our sense of belonging, by the way, is one of our fundamental needs as human beings. And you'll see the safety, security is coming here, that we have this need for understanding, to be able to talk. And then the next one, layer after that, that builds off of these, is that when those needs are met, then what we can do is we can develop a sense of self. Because first of all, I know my fundamental needs are met, because I've already learned that in 0 to 6 months. I've started to understand how there's all these social relationships around me, and they help to understand me. I know that they also watch what I'm doing. They help me get this sense of love and safety. And then from there, now they can also now children are free to be able to explore their environment and also develop a sense of self, right? Through play, through language, knowing that they can talk, and if they make a mistake, nobody cares. There are people there that are going to love and help correct them, and not make them feel afraid when they're learning those language skills or learning those social skills. Because if you have a parent who's attuned and they can read the child's social cues and reflect that back, or help them in terms of regulating the emotions, from all those things, if they have those skills, they're also going to be able to teach them social skills. And then children can start developing their own friendships and their own interactions with their peers. When children don't have that safety and security, it impacts brain development, and it impacts it significantly. And if I were teaching you the next phase of this course, one picture that you would see is this one here. And I use this one when I'm talking about the development of self-regulation. So the part, you have this part of your brain, the limbic system, you might remember that. That's the emotion center part of your brain. And then you have the part of the prefrontal cortex, which is executive functioning. And this is your thinking part, your planning, your problem solving, your emotion regulation, behavioral regulation, thinking regulation, all those different domains of self-regulation that Shanker talks about. And what happens is that when children are under stress, whether it's the context that creates the stress, for example, parental conflict, maybe the parent has mental health problems, or if they're in a poor attachment relationship where they don't feel like they're safe, secure, that their needs will be met, but they can't trust their primary caregiver, what happens is that the limbic part of the system will act first. And this is the part that's your flight or fight part of your brain. And so that's the first part that gets activated when you develop, when you're in a stressful situation. And so what happens for children is they end up developing these super highways to the limbic system, and less information, less memories are formed. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens, but the key part is the learning and thinking part of the brain becomes less active because they're under so much stress. And again, this is the stuff that Stuart Shanker talks about if you've ever had the fortune of being able to hear him speak. I talk about the brain part because I think it helps you understand the importance of the attachment and the implications of attachment for later on in terms of development. Because what you see is that children who are securely attached, they'll explore the world, feel very safe and secure. They've got a secure space, they got a safe haven, right? They got somebody they can proximity seek with. And one of the things that happens there too is because they have this internal working model where they see themselves as somebody that can contribute to relationships, that others want to be in a relationship with them, that they are worthy of being loved, that they have somebody who's taught them what are the skills involved in being in a relationship, then what they do is they expect positive outcomes from relationships. They're more socially confident. And how that's usually expressed is what you'll see is that they are much more social and will have a lot more peer relationships. The other thing is that children who have secure attachments tend to be very good at managing their emotions and dealing with stress. And this really has to do with whether I look at even social competence goes under the same thing, is that children who have good, secure relationships, attachment relationships, also have good self-regulation skills. One of the reasons is because their primary caregivers are great models of self-regulation, great models of resilience. But the other thing is because they can use that thinking part of their brain. They're not always in that chronic state of stress, so that they're not always going to the emotion side, but they're actually going to the thinking side of that brain that I showed you in the previous slide. And you contrast that with somebody who has a history of insecure attachment. We know it impacts brain development. And the other thing is they have trouble controlling their emotions and they're fearful. Why? Because that limbic part of the brain is very active, and so you don't see as much activity and as much neural development in terms of the prefrontal cortex and self-regulation skills, executive functioning. The other thing you'll see is that they have problems with their peers. Again, if we go back, it's contrasting with the other one, and that is that they don't have a strong internal working model. They don't understand how they fit into relationships with other people because they haven't had that learning experience. They haven't had that emotional experience to know that they are loved and how relationships work and how each person, how it's reciprocal, and how you can trust other people and you know they're going to look out for your best interests. Sometimes in extreme cases, what you'll see is that they can have failure to thrive. You may have heard of the disorder called reactive attachment disorder. Often what you'll just see is that usually individuals with insecure attachments, you might see things like they're more aggressive, angry, non-compliant, lower self-esteem. They may perform poorly in school. Again, this is not every insecure attachment. Understand that we're talking about correlations, but this gives you a sense of outcome. I wanted to end this lesson by just making it clear that children can form multiple attachments. So it's not just an attachment with mother or attachment with father. So children certainly can have a relationship with a father or a mother. Sometimes even I catch myself and I do mother, and that really is just my own upbringing in terms of my academic training. But children certainly have great relationships with fathers. We also see this when we look at men who are in gay relationships and they're raising a child. Same with lesbian relationships where the child attaches to both. You can also see it where the primary attachment figure might be the grandparents, particularly if the grandparents are involved in helping to raise the child. And then also siblings. Sometimes siblings, especially if they're quite a bit older, they can even take on the parental role in some cases and be the buffer for children. Then also I wanted to put here that you matter a great deal. And this is the point where I really like to emphasize that you spend a number of hours with children, and so you impact them, and your care really matters. And I always like, if I was in my class, I always like to share the story of a young boy, and he came from a family where he was witnessing considerable domestic violence, and it ended with his mother being severely disabled as a result of the domestic violence, and his father was jailed. But this young boy had, I think it was actually a stepfather, I should say, because he had a very complicated family. I think he had like 2 stepmoms, 2 stepdads, so there was like lots of multiple relationships in there. And I remember talking to him, and I was so proud of him, and he said to me, you know what helped me out and he gave the name of the educator that was at the daycare he was at when he was 4 years old. And I still get quite teary-eyed when I think about it, because he said, whenever I sit there and I think about the fact that maybe I'm not lovable, or I think about how come I have such a crappy life, I always think about so-and-so when I was at the blah 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 daycare, and she made me remember that I'm lovable and I'm strong. And he started just whipping off all of these wonderful traits that he had. And he said, these aren't the things my mom could tell me, because you know what? She was too busy trying to protect me from his stepfather. And he said, but it was okay because this caregiver, this educator, reminded him about that. And he could articulate it that way. And I share that with you because I think sometimes we forget about the role that educators play, especially when you're with these children for so many years. And so that's also why I like to spend a lot of time on attachment, so that you can understand how those little things you do in a child care center, an education center, isn't just about meeting the needs of the child and helping to facilitate development. You are also impacting things like their internal working model and helping them understand about relationships and how they fit into relationships, and the fact that they are lovable and worthy of forming trusting, secure relationships with other people.